Chapter 1. The Funeral's Final Humiliation. Rain hammered the cemetery like bullets against stone, each drop echoing the hollow ache in Seraphina's chest as she stood before her mother's casket. The black dress hung loose on her thin frame, a borrowed thing that reminded everyone she couldn't even afford proper funeral attire. Whispers cut through the storm, worthless, burden, mistake, words that had followed her since childhood now spoken over fresh earth. Her stepfamily stood apart, their expensive umbrellas creating a barrier between them and the girl they'd never wanted. Marcus, her stepbrother, wore a smirk that promised this humiliation was far from over. The pastor's voice droned about eternal rest, but Seraphina heard only the cruel laughter of her cousin Vivian. "Look at her," Vivian whispered loud enough for half the mourners to hear. "Even at her own mother's funeral, she looks like a street rat. Mother always said charity cases never learn their place." The words struck deeper than any physical blow. Seraphina's fingers trembled as she clutched a single white rose, the only flower she could afford for the woman who'd given her life, then spent 18 years regretting it. Around her, the wealthy elite of Ravencrest continued their whispered assassination of her character. Thunder split the sky as the casket began its descent, and Seraphina felt the last thread connecting her to any semblance of family snap. She was utterly alone now, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than an obligation finally fulfilled. Marcus stepped closer, his breath hot against her ear. "After today, you're nothing to us," he hissed. "Pack your rags and disappear. The Blackwood name was never yours anyway." His hand gripped her wrist with bruising force, a warning disguised as comfort. Several mourners turned away, unwilling to witness what they knew was abuse masked as grief. The cemetery fell silent except for the relentless rain, and Seraphina realized she had nowhere to go. The stepfamily home would be locked to her before the reception ended. Her mother's debts would ensure no inheritance reached her hands. At 18, she was about to become homeless in a city that devoured the weak. Her knees buckled slightly, but pride, the only thing she had left, kept her standing. The rose slipped from her numb fingers, landing on the mahogany wood with a soft thud that somehow echoed louder than thunder. As the mourners began to disperse, their duty done, Seraphina felt a presence behind her that made every nerve ending ignite. A warmth that shouldn't exist in this cold, cruel moment pressed against her back. Strong arms encircled her without permission, pulling her against a chest that radiated impossible heat. "You're not alone," a deep voice rumbled against her ear, the words carrying a promise that made her heart stutter. She should have pulled away, should have demanded answers, but instead she melted into the embrace of a complete stranger whose golden eyes seemed to see straight through to her soul. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in the Philippines, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. 24 hours earlier, Seraphina had been nothing more than a shadow in the Blackwood mansion, invisible until someone needed a target for their cruelty. The cancer had taken her mother slowly, each treatment paid for by Marcus's father with resentment that grew heavier by the day. Every dollar spent on that woman could have gone to something useful, she'd overheard him tell Marcus. "At least when she's gone, we'll be rid of both of them." The words had carved themselves into her memory like scars, preparing her for this moment when their hatred would finally have free rein. Her mother's final weeks had been spent in a sterile hospital room where Seraphina slept in chairs and survived on vending machine crackers. The nurses whispered about the poor girl who never left, who held her mother's hand through every labored breath. On the last night, her mother had gripped her fingers with surprising strength. "My beautiful girl," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible over the machines. "You're worth more than they could ever understand. Promise me you'll find where you belong." It was the kindest thing her mother had said in years, and it broke Seraphina's heart because she knew it was goodbye. Now, standing in the stranger's arms, she felt something impossible stirring in her chest, hope. His scent was intoxicating, like pine forests and winter storms, nothing like the suffocating cologne of her stepfamily's circle. When she finally turned in his embrace, she found herself looking up into eyes that seemed to glow even in the gray afternoon light. He was tall, devastatingly handsome in a way that made her feel foolish for noticing, but it was the gentleness in his expression that undid her completely. No one had looked at her with kindness in so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like. "My name is Kieran," he said, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. His touch sent electricity racing through her veins, a sensation so foreign and overwhelming that she gasped. "I know this isn't the time or place, but I couldn't watch them destroy you without saying something." His voice carried an authority that made several lingering mourners step back instinctively, though they couldn't understand why. Marcus, who had been approaching with his typical swagger, stopped mid-stride as if an invisible force had wrapped around his throat. "I don't understand," Seraphina whispered, but her body betrayed her confusion by pressing closer to Kieran's warmth. Everything about this moment defied logic, the way he'd appeared exactly when she needed saving, the way her skin hummed where he touched her, the way Marcus suddenly looked afraid. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Kieran's smile was soft, but carried an edge of something dangerous, something that made her pulse quicken for entirely different reasons. "I know enough," he replied, his golden eyes never leaving hers. "And I know you deserve so much more than their cruelty." The Blackwood estate loomed before them like a fortress designed to keep people like Seraphina on the outside. Kieran had insisted on driving her home, his sleek black car a stark contrast to the rusty sedan her mother had driven until the repo men claimed it. As they pulled through the wrought iron gates, Seraphina felt the familiar weight of inadequacy settle on her shoulders. This place had never been home. It was a prison where she'd served an 18-year sentence for the crime of existing. The Gothic architecture that others found impressive only reminded her of a mausoleum, cold and unwelcoming as the family who lived within its walls. Marcus was waiting on the front steps, his face twisted with rage that barely contained something deeper and more vicious. Behind him stood Vivian and two of her friends, their expressions predatory as they watched Seraphina emerge from Kieran's car. Well, Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the manicured lawn. The charity case found herself a sugar daddy at her own mother's funeral. How perfectly pathetic. The words were designed to wound, but Seraphina felt Kieran's presence beside her like a shield. His hand found the small of her back, a touch that sent warmth spiraling through her entire body. "You should choose your words more carefully," Kieran said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, yet every person on the steps heard him clearly. There was something in his tone that made the air itself seem to thicken, a warning that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to primal instincts. Marcus took an involuntary step backward, confusion flickering across his features as his body reacted to a threat his mind couldn't identify. Vivian's cruel smile faltered as she found herself unable to meet Kieran's golden gaze, her usual venom dying in her throat. Inside her childhood bedroom, a sparse space in the servants' quarters that emphasized her place in the family hierarchy, Seraphina began packing her few belongings into a battered suitcase. Each item told the story of a girl who'd never been allowed to take up space: secondhand clothes, a single treasured book, a photo of her mother from happier times. Kieran watched from the doorway, his presence filling the small room with an energy that made her hyper-aware of every movement. "This isn't right," he said finally, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "A young woman shouldn't have to live like this." When Marcus appeared in the hallway, clearly having worked up enough courage to confront them, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Time's up, half-sister," he sneered, though he kept his distance from Kieran. "Father's will was very clear, you get nothing. Whatever sob story you've told your new friend here, the truth is you're a burden nobody wants." His words were punctuated by the crack of thunder outside, and in that moment, Seraphina saw something flicker in Kieran's eyes, a flash of gold so bright it was almost inhuman. The lights in the hallway flickered, and Marcus stumbled backward as if pushed by an invisible hand, his bravado crumbling into something that looked suspiciously like fear. Chapter 2: The Alpha's Shadow. Kieran's penthouse apartment defied everything Seraphina thought she knew about the world. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Ravencrest's glittering skyline, while the interior spoke of wealth beyond imagination, but it was the way he moved through the space that captivated her. Every step was controlled, predatory, like a wolf stalking through his territory. When he handed her a cup of tea, their fingers brushed, and she felt that electric shock again, stronger this time, accompanied by the strangest sensation that her skin was trying to reach for his. Something was happening to her, something that defied rational explanation. "Tell me about yourself," Kieran said, settling into the chair across from her with fluid grace. His golden eyes seemed to glow in the lamplight, and Seraphina found herself sharing things she'd never told another soul. The loneliness that had consumed her childhood, the cruelty that had shaped her teenage years, the dreams she'd buried because survival took all her energy. With each confession, Kieran's expression grew darker, a muscle in his jaw twitching as if he was restraining himself from some violent action. When she described Marcus's worst abuse, Kieran's grip on his coffee cup tightened until she heard the ceramic crack. The storm outside intensified as night fell, and Seraphina found herself curled on Kieran's impossibly comfortable couch, wrapped in a cashmere throw that probably cost more than she'd ever owned. "You can stay here tonight," he said, and something in his voice made it sound less like an offer and more like a command. "Tomorrow we'll figure out your next steps." She should have been afraid. Staying with a stranger went against every safety rule she'd ever learned, but instead, she felt safer than she had in years. There was something about Kieran that promised protection, even if she couldn't understand why. As she drifted toward sleep, Seraphina caught glimpses of Kieran moving through the apartment with inhuman silence. Once, she could have sworn she saw his reflection in the window showing something impossible, a figure far larger than human, with eyes that burned like molten gold. But when she blinked, he was just a man again, though the air around him still seemed to vibrate with barely contained power. Her dreams were filled with wolves running through moonlit forests, their howls calling to something deep in her soul that she'd never known existed. She woke to the sound of her phone buzzing with increasingly threatening messages from Marcus. Each text was more vicious than the last, promising consequences for embarrassing the family, for bringing a stranger into their business. The final message made her blood run cold. "Enjoy your new boyfriend while you can." Some people don't know when to stay away from what belongs to others. When she showed the messages to Kieran, his reaction was immediate and terrifying. His eyes flashed that impossible gold, and the windows rattled as if the building itself had shuddered with rage. "He made a mistake threatening you," Kieran said, his voice carrying a promise of retribution that made her shiver. 3 weeks in Kieran's world transformed Seraphina in ways she couldn't have imagined. The constant fear that had lived in her chest since childhood began to ease, replaced by something far more dangerous: hope. Kieran enrolled her in college courses she'd only dreamed of affording, bought her clothes that made her feel beautiful instead of invisible, and treated her with a reverence that left her breathless. But it was the small moments that undid her completely. The way he watched her with predatory intensity when she laughed, the careful distance he maintained as if afraid his touch might burn her, the growls that rumbled from his chest when other men looked at her too long. The chemistry between them was becoming impossible to ignore. Every accidental touch sent lightning through her veins, and she found herself craving his presence with an intensity that frightened her. When he helped her with her jacket, his fingers would linger on her shoulders until she felt dizzy. When he stood behind her to reach something high, his body would bracket hers and she'd catch his scent, that intoxicating blend of forest and storm that made her want to press closer. The air between them crackled with unspoken desire, and Seraphina began to understand that whatever was happening to her heart, Kieran was fighting the same battle. Marcus's harassment escalated with each passing day. He appeared outside her classes, left threatening voicemails, and somehow found Kieran's address to send packages containing photos of her as a child with cruel messages scrawled across them. "You think you can just disappear?" One note read. "You think some rich boyfriend can protect you from what you are? You're nothing, and nothing is where you belong." Each threat pushed Kieran closer to some invisible edge, his control slipping in ways that should have terrified her but instead made her feel powerful. She was affecting him, this man who seemed to command the world around him. The night everything changed started like any other. Seraphina was studying at Kieran's dining table while he worked on his laptop, the domestic scene so perfect it made her chest ache with longing. When she dropped her pen and bent to retrieve it, Kieran was suddenly there, his hand covering hers on the marble floor. The contact sent such a powerful shock through her that she gasped, and when she looked up, his golden eyes were blazing with an intensity that stole her breath. "Seraphina," he whispered, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips. The space between them disappeared, and she could feel the heat radiating from his body like a furnace. "I can't," he said, but his body betrayed his words as he pulled her to her feet, his hands framing her face with trembling reverence. "You don't understand what you do to me, what I am." His voice was raw with need and something that sounded like fear. The rational part of her mind noted the strange phrasing, but her body was too busy responding to his proximity to care about words. When his thumb traced her lower lip, she felt something inside her click into place, like a key finding its lock. "Then show me," she whispered, and the sound that escaped his throat was pure animal hunger, a growl that should have terrified her but instead made her pulse race with anticipation. Chapter 3: The Beast Within. The kiss that followed rewrote Seraphina's understanding of desire. Kieran's lips were demanding, desperate, as if he'd been starving and she was his salvation. His hands tangled in her hair, tilting her head to deepen the contact, and she felt something wild awakening in her chest, a hunger that matched his intensity. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes were no longer entirely human. The gold was brighter, more animalistic, and she could swear she saw flecks of amber swirling in their depths. "You should run," he whispered against her lips, but his arms tightened around her waist, betraying his true desires. The scent that had always intoxicated her, pine forests and winter storms, intensified until it filled her lungs with something that felt ancient and powerful. Instead of running, Seraphina pressed closer, her hands exploring the solid muscle of his chest. She could feel his heart racing beneath her palms, matching the frantic rhythm of her own. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, and meant it with a conviction that surprised them both. Something shifted in Kieran's expression then, a wall crumbling that he'd kept carefully constructed. His control, which she was beginning to realize was the foundation of his entire existence, slipped another notch. When he kissed her again, she tasted something wild and dangerous, something that called to a part of her she'd never known existed. The kiss deepened, becoming more primal, more desperate, as if they were both trying to merge their very souls through the connection of their lips. Kieran's hands moved with reverent urgency, mapping every curve of her body as if memorizing her for eternity. The air around them began to shimmer with an energy that neither of them fully understood. Seraphina felt heat building in her chest, spreading through her veins like liquid fire, but instead of burning, it felt like coming home. Kieran's touch seemed to ignite something dormant within her, something that had been sleeping her entire life. When his lips moved to her neck, she gasped at the sensation, not just physical pleasure, but something deeper, a recognition that went beyond human understanding. Her skin tingled wherever he touched, leaving trails of warmth that pulsed with their own rhythm. The penthouse around them seemed to fade into irrelevance as they lost themselves in each other, two souls finally finding their missing pieces. The moment shattered when Kieran's phone rang with an urgency that cut through their haze of desire. His assistant's voice was tight with fear. "Sir, there's been an incident. Marcus Blackwood is here with 3 men, demanding to see you. They're saying things about Miss Seraphina that I can't repeat. Security is holding them in the lobby, but sir, they're getting aggressive." Kieran's transformation was immediate and terrifying. The tender man who'd been kissing her seconds ago disappeared, replaced by something predatory and dangerous. His eyes blazed with inhuman fury, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quality that made the windows vibrate. "Bring them up." The change in him was so complete, so sudden, that Seraphina felt a chill of premonition race down her spine. "Kieran, no," Seraphina pleaded, recognizing the murderous intent in his expression. But he was already moving toward the elevator, his movements flowing with a grace that was distinctly non-human. She followed, her heart pounding with terror not for herself, but for what Kieran might do to Marcus in his current state. The elevator ride felt eternal, tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. When the doors opened, Marcus strutted out with his usual arrogance, flanked by 3 men who looked like they'd been hired for violence. His confident smirk faltered the moment he saw Kieran's face, some primitive instinct recognizing a predator when confronted with one. The air itself seemed to thicken with menace as Kieran stepped forward, every line of his body screaming danger. Well, Marcus sneered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "The mysterious benefactor. I hope you know what kind of trash you've taken in." Seraphina's been spreading her legs for money since he never finished the sentence. Kieran moved faster than human eyes could track, his hand wrapping around Marcus's throat and lifting him off the ground. The display of strength was impossible, inhuman, and Marcus's face turned purple as he clawed helplessly at fingers that felt like steel bands. In that moment, with Kieran's eyes blazing gold and his control completely shattered, Seraphina finally understood that the man she was falling in love with was something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The hired men backed away in terror, their bravado crumbling as they witnessed something that defied natural law. The sound that rumbled from Kieran's chest was unlike anything Seraphina had ever heard, a growl so deep and primal it seemed to vibrate through her bones. Marcus dangled in his grip like a broken doll, his hired muscles scrambling toward the elevator in terror as something beyond their comprehension unfolded before them. "You made a mistake coming here," Kieran said, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke to every survival instinct screaming warnings. The lights in the penthouse flickered, and the air itself seemed to thicken with an otherworldly presence. When Kieran's free hand flexed, Seraphina caught a glimpse of something impossible, claws extending from human fingertips. The transformation had begun, and there would be no hiding what he truly was. "Please," Marcus wheezed, his arrogance completely evaporated as he stared into eyes that were no longer remotely human. The gold had intensified to an almost burning brightness, and behind them lurked something ancient and predatory. Kieran's grip tightened fractionally, and Marcus's struggles became more desperate. "I didn't know, I didn't understand." But his pleas died as Kieran leaned closer, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "You will never speak her name again. You will never think of her again. If you so much as breathe in her direction, I will show you what true terror looks like." The words were punctuated by the sound of fabric tearing as Kieran's frame began to expand, his human form struggling to contain what lay beneath. The transformation began slowly, so subtle that at first Seraphina thought the stress was making her hallucinate. Kieran's frame seemed to expand, his muscles bulging beneath his shirt as his human facade cracked. His face elongated slightly, jaw becoming more pronounced, and when he bared his teeth in a snarl, they were longer and sharper than any humans had a right to be. The scent that had always intoxicated her, pine and storms, intensified until it filled the entire room with wild, untamed power. This was no ordinary man. This was something that belonged to moonlit forests and ancient legends. Marcus's eyes widened in absolute terror as he witnessed something that shouldn't exist, his face draining of all color as primal fear took hold. "Werewolf," Marcus gasped, the word torn from his throat in a whisper of absolute terror. The confirmation hit Seraphina like a physical blow, but instead of fear, she felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The impossible strength, the predatory grace, the way he'd known exactly when she needed saving, it all made sense now. Kieran's eyes found hers across the room, and in them she saw not the monster Marcus believed him to be, but a creature of immense power who had chosen to be gentle with her. The revelation should have sent her running, but instead she stepped closer, drawn by an instinct deeper than rational thought. Something within her chest began to pulse with warmth, responding to his supernatural nature with recognition rather than fear. When Kieran finally released Marcus, dropping him to crumple on the marble floor, his attention never wavered from Seraphina's face. He was searching for fear, for rejection, for the same revulsion he'd probably faced countless times before. The hired men had long since fled, leaving only the three of them in the charged atmosphere of the penthouse. Kieran's partial transformation made him tower over them both, his presence filling the space with predatory power that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "Now you know what I am," he said, his voice thick with emotion and exhaustion. "I'm not human, Seraphina. I'm a creature of violence and instinct. I've killed to protect what's mine, and I'll kill again without hesitation." Instead of backing away, Seraphina approached him with steady steps, her heart racing not with terror but with a strange sense of coming home. "You're beautiful," she whispered, reaching up to touch his partially transformed features. At her words, at her acceptance, something shifted in the very fabric of reality around them. The transformation completed in a heartbeat, and where a man had stood, a massive wolf with golden eyes now dominated the space. The creature was magnificent, standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, his midnight black fur rippling with each breath. She could see the intelligence burning behind those familiar eyes, wholly human yet utterly wild. Marcus screamed and scrambled toward the elevator, but Seraphina never looked away from the magnificent creature before her. The moment Kieran's wolf form materialized completely, something extraordinary happened to Seraphina. His scent, now purely supernatural, wild, and ancient, hit her like a tidal wave of memory. The world around her dissolved, and suddenly she was 8 years old again, standing in her mother's hospital room during one of her early treatments. But this time, the memory was crystal clear, no longer filtered through a child's limited understanding. Her mother's hand gripped hers with desperate strength as she whispered words that Seraphina had always assumed were fevered dreams. "The locket," her mother had said, her eyes wild with urgency. "Under the floorboard in your room, beneath the loose board by the window. Your real father's gift. When the time comes, when you meet the one with golden eyes, you'll understand." The flashback was so vivid, so overwhelming, that Seraphina gasped and staggered backward. She remembered her mother's strange behavior in those final weeks, the way she'd spoken of things that made no sense, the desperate way she'd clung to Seraphina's hand while whispering about bloodlines and destinies. At the time, everyone had attributed it to the medication, to the cancer eating away at her brain. But standing here in the presence of Kieran's supernatural nature, Seraphina realized her mother hadn't been delirious. She'd been trying to prepare her daughter for this moment, trying to pass on knowledge that couldn't wait for a more convenient time. "I have to go," Seraphina said suddenly, her voice shaking with urgency. The wolf that was Kieran tilted his massive head, golden eyes filled with concern and confusion. She could see the intelligence there, the man trapped within the beast form, trying to understand her sudden shift in behavior. My mother left something for me. Something I need to find." She turned toward the elevator, her mind racing with possibilities and half-remembered conversations that suddenly seemed incredibly important. Marcus had already fled, leaving the elevator free, and she could feel Kieran following her, his wolf form moving with silent grace across the marble floor. The drive to the Blackwood estate felt surreal, with Kieran having shifted back to human form and dressed hastily in clothes from his emergency bag. His eyes never left her face as she explained the fragments of memory that had surfaced, the pieces of her mother's final words that had suddenly snapped into focus. "She was trying to tell me something," Seraphina said, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. "All those times I thought she was just saying goodbye, she was actually giving me instructions. There's something hidden in my old room, something my real father left for me." The implications sent shivers down her spine. If her mother had been hiding something supernatural, then everything about her childhood took on a different meaning. The Blackwood mansion loomed before them like a monument to cruelty, its Gothic architecture more forbidding than ever in the evening light. They slipped through the garden entrance, avoiding the main house where Marcus and his father were likely plotting their next move. Seraphina's old room in the servants' quarters felt smaller than she remembered, the sparse furnishings and bare walls a testament to her place in the family hierarchy. But now, instead of seeing evidence of her worthlessness, she began to notice things she'd never paid attention to before: the way the room was positioned to catch the moonlight, the strange symbols carved so faintly into the window frame that they looked like natural wood grain, the precise placement of her bed that left the far corner suspiciously empty. "There," she whispered, pointing to the corner where a loose floorboard had always creaked under her feet. Kieran's supernatural senses were immediately alert, his nostrils flaring as he caught scents that human nose couldn't detect. "There's something there," he confirmed, his voice tight with anticipation. Something old, something powerful. Together, they pried up the floorboard, and beneath it lay a small wooden box wrapped in what looked like silk that had somehow remained pristine despite decades of hiding. When Seraphina lifted the box, her skin tingled with recognition, as if the object was somehow calling to her on a cellular level. Inside the box, nestled in faded velvet, lay the most beautiful piece of jewelry Seraphina had ever seen. The locket was made of silver so pure it seemed to glow with its own light, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move when she wasn't looking directly at them. The moment her fingers closed around the chain, the locket began to pulse with warmth, and when Kieran's wolf scent reached her again, the silver burst into brilliant light that filled the entire room. With trembling fingers, she opened the locket, and inside found a miniature portrait that made her heart stop. The man in the painting had the same golden eyes as Kieran, the same aristocratic features, but there was something else, an otherworldly beauty that spoke of power beyond mortal understanding. Beneath the portrait, etched in script so tiny she had to squint to read it, were words in a language she'd never seen before. But somehow, impossibly, she could understand them. As she read the inscription aloud, her voice carried harmonics that made the air itself shimmer, "The Phoenix King's heir lives." The words hung in the air like a declaration, and suddenly everything clicked into place with devastating clarity. Her mother's illness hadn't been cancer, it had been the result of suppressing her supernatural nature for nearly 2 decades. Every moment of emotional distance, every cruel word, every time her mother had seemed to withdraw from her had been an act of desperate protection. "My God," Kieran breathed, his eyes wide with recognition and something approaching awe. "Seraphina, do you understand what this means?" The Phoenix bloodline was thought extinct. They were the natural mates of alpha werewolves, beings of immense power who could heal with fire and command the very elements. "If you're the Phoenix King's heir..." He trailed off, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. The locket continued to pulse in her hands, its light growing brighter as her emotions intensified. She could feel something awakening within her, something that had been dormant her entire life, waiting for this moment of revelation. The truth crashed over her in waves, recontextualizing every memory of her childhood. Her mother's strange behavior during thunderstorms, the way she'd always insisted Seraphina sleep with windows open even in winter, the herbal teas that tasted like smoke and starlight. All of it had been her mother's desperate attempt to keep some connection to their supernatural heritage while suppressing the dangerous manifestations of power. "She wasn't abandoning me," Seraphina whispered, tears streaming down her face as understanding bloomed in her chest. "She was protecting me." Every cruel word, every moment she seemed to pull away, she was trying to keep me from accidentally triggering abilities that would have gotten us both killed. Kieran pulled her into his arms as the full weight of revelation settled around them. The locket burned against her chest, and she could feel her heritage awakening like a phoenix rising from ashes. Her mother hadn't been weak or broken, she'd been a guardian, sacrificing her own happiness and health to keep the last Phoenix heir safe until she was strong enough to claim her birthright. The woman who had seemed so distant and cold had actually loved her more than life itself, enough to live as a shadow of herself for 18 years. "Your mother was a hero," Kieran said softly, his voice thick with emotion. She gave up everything to keep you safe, to make sure you survived long enough to find your true mate and claim your power. As if summoned by their conversation, the locket's light suddenly intensified, and Seraphina felt fire begin to dance along her skin without burning. The Phoenix bloodline was awakening, and with it came the understanding that her love story with Kieran was more than romance, it was destiny. The mate bond between a phoenix and an alpha werewolf was the stuff of legend, a connection so powerful it could reshape the supernatural world. Her mother's sacrifice had ensured she lived to find her other half, and now that she had, nothing would ever be the same. The scared, worthless girl who had stood at her mother's funeral was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood her true worth and the incredible love that had kept her safe until this moment. Chapter 4: The Alpha Revealed. The sound that rumbled from Kieran's chest was unlike anything Seraphina had ever heard, a growl so deep and primal it seemed to vibrate through her bones. Marcus dangled in his grip like a broken doll, his hard muscle backing away in terror as something beyond their comprehension unfolded before them. "You made a mistake coming here," Kieran said, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke to every survival instinct screaming warnings. The lights in the penthouse flickered, and the air itself seemed to thicken with an otherworldly presence. When Kieran's free hand flexed, Seraphina caught a glimpse of something impossible, claws extending from human fingertips. "Please," Marcus wheezed, his arrogance completely evaporated as he stared into eyes that were no longer remotely human. The gold had intensified to an almost burning brightness, and behind them lurked something ancient and predatory. Kieran's grip tightened fractionally, and Marcus's struggles became more desperate. "I didn't know, I didn't understand," but his pleas died as Kieran leaned closer, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "You will never speak her name again. You will never think of her again. If you so much as breathe in her direction, I will show you what true terror looks like." The transformation began slowly, so subtle that at first Seraphina thought the stress was making her hallucinate. Kieran's frame seemed to expand, his muscles bulging beneath his shirt as his human facade cracked. His face elongated slightly, jaw becoming more pronounced, and when he bared his teeth in a snarl, they were longer and sharper than any humans had a right to be. The scent that had always intoxicated her, pine and storms, intensified until it filled the entire room with wild, untamed power. This was no ordinary man. This was something that belonged to moonlit forests and ancient legends. "Werewolf," Marcus gasped, the word torn from his throat in a whisper of absolute terror. The confirmation hit Seraphina like a physical blow, but instead of fear, she felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The impossible strength, the predatory grace, the way he'd known exactly when she needed saving, it all made sense now. Kieran's eyes found hers across the room, and in them she saw not the monster Marcus believed him to be, but a creature of immense power who had chosen to be gentle with her. The revelation should have sent her running, but instead she stepped closer, drawn by an instinct deeper than rational thought. When Kieran finally released Marcus, dropping him to crumple on the marble floor, his attention never wavered from Seraphina's face. He was searching for fear, for rejection, for the same revulsion he'd probably faced countless times before. Instead, she approached him with steady steps, her heart racing not with terror but with a strange sense of coming home. "You're beautiful," she whispered, reaching up to touch his partially transformed features. At her words, at her acceptance, Kieran's control snapped entirely. The shift completed in a heartbeat, and where a man had stood, a massive wolf with golden eyes now dominated the space. Marcus screamed and fled with his men, but Seraphina never looked away from the magnificent creature before her, finally understanding why her soul had recognized its mate from the very first moment. The wolf that was Kieran stood motionless in the center of his penthouse, golden eyes fixed on Seraphina with an intensity that should have been terrifying. Standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, his midnight black fur rippled with each breath, and she could see the intelligence burning behind those familiar eyes, wholly human yet utterly wild. The rational part of her mind screamed that she should run, should call for help, should do anything except stand transfixed by the most beautiful and dangerous creature she'd ever seen. Instead, she found herself taking another step forward, drawn by an instinct that felt older than civilization itself. The phoenix locket around her neck pulsed with warmth, responding to his supernatural presence with a recognition that went beyond mere attraction. "I know you're still in there," she whispered, extending her hand toward the massive wolf. Every fairy tale she'd ever heard warned against this moment, but those stories had never mentioned the way her heart sang in the presence of something so magnificently powerful. When Kieran's wet nose touched her palm, the contact sent shockwaves through her entire being, not fear, but recognition. This was her protector, her savior, the man who'd seen worth in her when no one else had bothered to look. The wolf whined softly, a sound of such longing that it brought tears to her eyes. Her newly awakened phoenix heritage seemed to hum in response to his wolf nature, two halves of an ancient whole finally coming together. The transformation back to human form was fluid poetry, muscles and bones reshaping themselves with supernatural grace. Within moments, Kieran knelt before her in all his naked glory, his head bowed as if awaiting judgment. The silver light from her locket cast ethereal patterns across his skin, and she could see the tension in every line of his body, the fear that, even knowing her true heritage, she might still reject what he was. "Now you know what I am," he said, his voice thick with emotion and exhaustion. "I'm not human, Seraphina. I'm the alpha of the Shadow Moon Pack, a creature of violence and instinct. I've killed to protect what's mine, and I'll kill again without hesitation." His hands trembled as he spoke, and she realized this powerful being was terrified. Not of her rejection, but of the possibility that she might accept him anyway. "Look at me," she commanded, her voice carrying a strength she'd never known she possessed, strengthened by the phoenix fire that now flowed through her veins. When his golden eyes met hers, she saw centuries of loneliness reflected in their depths, the weight of leadership and isolation that came with being what he was. "Do you think I care what you are?" she asked, reaching out to frame his face with hands that shook with emotion rather than fear. "You saved me when my own family wanted me to disappear. You've shown me kindness I never thought I deserved. If you're a monster, then what does that make the humans who tried to destroy me?" The locket's glow intensified as her emotions peaked, casting them both in silver fire that seemed to sanctify the moment. The kiss that followed was different from their first. Deeper, desperate, tinged with the knowledge that they were crossing a threshold from which there could be no return. Her phoenix nature responded to his touch like kindling to flame, sending spirals of warmth through her entire being. When Kieran pulled back, his eyes were blazing with something beyond desire, something primal and eternal that spoke to the very core of her supernatural heritage. "There's something else," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "From the moment I saw you at that cemetery, I knew. The mate bond doesn't lie, doesn't make mistakes. You're mine, Seraphina, in ways that go beyond human understanding. My wolf has claimed you, and that's a bond that can never be broken." As he spoke the words, she felt something click into place deep in her chest, a connection that went beyond love or attraction, a recognition that she'd found the other half of her soul. The phoenix locket blazed with silver fire, and suddenly she could feel everything Kieran felt, his emotions flowing through her like a river of molten gold. His love, his fierce protectiveness, his desperate need to keep her safe, it all flooded through their newly forged bond with an intensity that left her gasping. "I feel it too," she whispered, her hand pressed against her chest where warmth pulsed in perfect rhythm with his heartbeat. "This connection, this certainty that I belong with you. It's like my soul has been waiting my entire life for this moment." Kieran rose to his feet with predatory grace, pulling her against his chest as if he could merge their very beings through the force of his embrace. "The mate bond between a phoenix and an alpha is the stuff of legend," he murmured against her hair, his voice reverent with awe. "Our ancestors spoke of unions that could reshape the supernatural world, partnerships that combine the healing fire of the phoenix with the protective strength of the wolf. Together, we're more than either could be alone, were a force that could challenge the very foundations of supernatural law. His words sent shivers through her, not of fear but of anticipation for the future they could build together. The sacred moment was shattered by the sound of shattering glass in the living room, followed by the acrid stench of something unnatural and wrong. Kieran's transformation was immediate. His eyes blazed gold as his protective instincts surged to life, every muscle in his body coiling for violence. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an alpha as he moved toward the disturbance. Seraphina followed, the phoenix locket burning against her skin with increasing intensity, as if warning her of approaching danger. When they reached the main room, she saw Marcus standing amid a shower of broken glass, flanked by 6 figures in dark clothing who moved with inhuman stillness. Well, Marcus sneered, but there was something different about him now, something predatory and cold that made Seraphina's skin crawl. The little charity case found herself a puppy. How perfectly pathetic. His voice carried harmonics it had never possessed before, undertones that spoke of hunger and ancient malice. Kieran went rigid beside her, his nostrils flaring as he caught a scent that made him snarl with pure rage. "You're not human," Kieran growled, his voice barely recognizable as the fury of his wolf nature took hold. "What are you?" The question hung in the air like a blade, sharp with the promise of violence. Marcus laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass mixed with distant screams. "Oh, I'm so much more than human, dear sister," he said, and when he smiled, Seraphina caught a glimpse of fangs that hadn't been there before. "I'm exactly what you've been feeding for the past 18 years, you delicious little phoenix." The words hit her like physical blows, each revelation more horrifying than the last. "Did you really think it was coincidence that you always felt so drained around me? That every moment of joy in your life seemed to wither in my presence? I've been feeding off your emotional energy since you were a child, growing stronger while keeping you weak and hopeless." The truth crashed over Seraphina with devastating clarity, recontextualizing every memory of her childhood in horrifying new light. The way Marcus had always seemed to know exactly what would hurt her most, the inexplicable exhaustion that followed every interaction with him, the sense that her very life force was being drained away whenever he was near. "You're a vampire," she whispered, the words tasting like poison on her tongue. "You've been feeding off me this entire time." Marcus's smile widened, revealing the full extent of his fangs, and she realized with growing horror that she'd never been safe, not even as a child. "Half vampire, to be precise," Marcus corrected with mock politeness. "Just enough supernatural nature to recognize what you are, to slowly drain your power while you remained blissfully unaware. Do you have any idea how delicious phoenix energy tastes? How intoxicating it is to feed off centuries of stored power." His eyes glowed with an unholy light as he spoke, and Seraphina felt sick with the knowledge of how thoroughly she'd been violated. "Every tear you shed, every moment of despair, every night you cried yourself to sleep, I was there, drinking it all in, growing stronger while you grew weaker." Kieran's rage was a living thing, filling the room with the promise of bloody retribution. His partial transformation began without conscious thought, his frame expanding as his wolf nature demanded justice for his mate. "I'm going to tear you apart," he snarled, his voice distorting as his jaw elongated and his teeth sharpened to deadly points. "You fed off my mate's suffering for 18 years, I'll make you pay for every single moment of pain you caused her." The air around him shimmered with barely contained violence, and even Marcus's supernatural allies took an involuntary step backward from the fury of an enraged alpha protecting his phoenix. "Oh, but you don't understand the best part yet," Marcus continued, his tone conversational despite the immediate threat of Kieran's wrath. "You see, my father's charity in taking in dear Seraphina's mother wasn't charity at all. It was a carefully orchestrated supernatural trafficking operation. The Crimson Dawn Coven has been hunting Phoenix bloodlines for centuries, and when they discovered that Elena Blackwood was the last Phoenix Guardian, they sent me to monitor the situation." His revelation struck like lightning, illuminating the full scope of the conspiracy that had shaped Seraphina's entire life. "My mother," Seraphina gasped, her hand flying to the phoenix locket that now burned against her skin like a brand. She knew. She knew what you were doing to me. The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity, her mother's increasing distance, the way she'd seemed to withdraw more each year, the desperate urgency in her final words about the locket and Seraphina's true heritage. She wasn't pulling away because she didn't love me. She was trying to protect me from you. Marcus clapped slowly, mockingly. Brilliant deduction, sister dear. Yes, Elena knew exactly what I was, and she spent 18 years trying to find a way to keep you safe while slowly dying from the effort. You see, suppressing phoenix fire doesn't just weaken the bloodline, it's literally toxic to the guardian. Every day she held back your powers. Every moment she prevented your awakening, she was poisoning herself to keep you hidden from us. His words were daggers designed to wound, and Seraphina felt her phoenix fire respond to her anguish, flames beginning to dance along her skin without burning. But the cancer wasn't cancer at all, was it? Seraphina whispered, the full horror of her mother's sacrifice becoming clear. It was the phoenix fire eating her alive from the inside because she was suppressing it to protect me. Marcus nodded with grotesque satisfaction, clearly enjoying her pain. She could have saved herself at any time by letting your powers manifest naturally. Instead, she chose to die slowly, keeping you weak enough that I could feed off you without triggering your defensive abilities. What a devoted mother, literally killing herself to keep her daughter's blood tasty for a vampire. Kieran's control finally snapped completely. His transformation exploded outward in a surge of supernatural fury, his human form giving way to something far larger and more terrible than his normal wolf shape. This was the Alpha in his full glory, a creature of legend standing nearly 6 feet at the shoulder, his midnight fur crackling with otherworldly energy. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of pack law and ancient justice. You fed off the suffering of my mate. You killed her mother through slow torture. You exist as an affront to everything sacred in the supernatural world. Tonight you die. The battle that erupted was like something from a nightmare. Marcus and his vampire allies moved with inhuman speed, but they had underestimated the fury of a mated alpha protecting his phoenix. Kieran was death incarnate, his massive form flowing through the penthouse like liquid shadow, claws and fangs finding their targets with supernatural precision. But for every vampire that fell, another seemed to take its place, and Seraphina realized with growing horror that this had been planned as more than just a confrontation, it was a harvesting operation. The Crimson Dawn Coven needs phoenix fire to break an ancient curse, Marcus called out over the sounds of battle, still maintaining his conversational tone even as supernatural violence raged around him. The most powerful vampires in our bloodline have been bound to the shadows for 1,000 years, unable to walk in daylight or access their full potential. But phoenix fire can burn away any curse, can grant us the power we've been denied for centuries. His explanation was interrupted as Kieran's massive form slammed into one of his allies, reducing the vampire to ash with a single swipe of his claws. That's why you kept me weak, Seraphina realized, her own power beginning to surge as her emotions peaked. You didn't just want to feed off me, you were conditioning me, keeping my fire suppressed so that when you finally harvested it, I wouldn't be able to fight back. The phoenix locket blazed like a star against her chest, and she felt her heritage awakening with explosive force. Fire danced along her skin, silver and gold flames that burned with the heat of a dying star, and suddenly she understood why vampires had hunted her bloodline to near extinction. Marcus's expression changed from smug satisfaction to genuine alarm as he witnessed the full awakening of phoenix power. That's impossible, he snarled, his fangs fully extended as survival instincts overrode his confidence. Your fire should be weak, barely a candle flame after 18 years of suppression. You shouldn't be able to. His words were cut off as Seraphina raised her hand and silver fire erupted from her palm, reducing 2 of his vampire allies to ash before they could even scream. The phoenix bloodline had awakened, and with it came the understanding that she was no longer prey. She was the predator these creatures had good reason to fear. The tide of battle turned in an instant. Kieran's alpha fury combined with Seraphina's phoenix fire created a devastating partnership that the vampires simply couldn't match. Where his claws and fangs dealt death, her flames purified the very air of their unnatural presence. Marcus, faced with the reality of his own mortality, made a desperate leap toward the shattered window, but Seraphina's fire followed him like a living thing, wrapping around his legs and dragging him back into the penthouse. 18 years, she said, her voice carrying harmonics of power that made the remaining vampires cower in terror. 18 years you fed off my pain, my mother's sacrifice, my family's suffering. Now you get to learn what Phoenix justice feels like. As the last of Marcus's allies crumbled to ash, the half-vampire found himself facing the combined fury of a mated alpha and his phoenix. The predator who had tormented Seraphina for nearly 2 decades was now reduced to cowering prey, his supernatural arrogance replaced by the very terror he had spent years inflicting on others. "Please," he whispered, the word foreign on his lips. "I was just following orders. The coven made me do it. I didn't have a choice." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. Kieran and Seraphina had found each other despite his machinations, and now their bond would ensure that justice was finally served for all the years of suffering he had caused. Chapter 5: The Alpha's Claim. The revelation of the mate bond sent tremors through Seraphina's entire being, as if her soul was rewiring itself to accommodate this new truth. She could feel Kieran's emotions as if they were her own. His fierce protectiveness, his desperate love, his terror that she might still flee from what they'd discovered together. When she looked into his golden eyes, she saw not just the man who'd saved her, but centuries of waiting for this moment, for her. The phoenix locket around her neck pulsed with silver fire, responding to the supernatural energy crackling between them with increasing intensity. "I don't understand what's happening to me," she whispered, pressing her hand to her chest where warmth pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. "But I feel it too. This connection. Like I've been incomplete my whole life without even knowing it." The air around them shimmered with otherworldly energy as their supernatural natures recognized each other on the deepest possible level. Seraphina could taste the wild freedom of moonlit forests on her tongue, could feel the phantom sensation of running through ancient woods with pack bonds singing in her blood. Meanwhile, Kieran's wolf nature responded to her phoenix fire with a hunger that went beyond physical desire. This was spiritual starvation finally finding sustenance after lifetimes of emptiness. The locket's glow intensified until it cast silver shadows across the walls, and she realized that their bonding was triggering something far more significant than either of them had anticipated. Kieran's response was to lift her into his arms with inhuman ease, carrying her toward his bedroom with purpose that made her pulse race. His golden eyes blazed with an intensity that spoke of barely restrained need, and she could feel his wolf nature straining against his human control. "The mate bond is sacred among our kind," he explained, his voice thick with desire and reverence. "It's the joining of souls, the recognition that two beings are meant to be one. When I claim you fully, when you accept me completely, nothing in this world will be able to separate us." His words should have frightened her, but instead they filled her with a sense of rightness she'd never experienced. This was why she'd never fit anywhere else. She'd been waiting for him. The bedroom felt transformed by their presence, the very air charged with supernatural electricity that made her skin tingle with anticipation. When Kieran set her down beside his bed, his hands trembled with the effort of maintaining control. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough with barely contained hunger. "Once we complete this bond, there will be no going back. You'll be mine in ways that transcend human understanding, and I'll be yours for eternity." The phoenix fire within her responded to his words, spreading warmth through her entire being as if her very cells were singing in recognition of their destined union. Their union was everything the mate bond promised and more. Kieran worshipped her body with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes, his touch igniting fires she'd never known could burn within her. Every caress was a promise, every kiss a sacred vow that bound them together on levels beyond the physical. When he finally made her his, the sensation was transcendent. She felt their souls merging, their essence becoming intertwined in ways that defied human understanding. The phoenix locket blazed like a star between them, its silver light merging with the golden glow of Kieran's wolf nature until the entire room was bathed in otherworldly radiance. In that moment of ultimate intimacy, as their bodies moved together in perfect harmony, something extraordinary happened to Kieran. The mate bond completion triggered a vision so powerful it felt like being struck by lightning. He saw himself not as he'd always believed, a successful alpha who'd built his pack through strength and cunning, but as something far more significant and terrifying. Images flooded his mind with devastating clarity, ancient ceremonies where his bloodline was specifically created through supernatural ritual, generations of his ancestors serving as guardians to the Phoenix line. His own birth prophesied and orchestrated by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The vision revealed the truth about his destiny with merciless precision. He wasn't just any alpha, he was the last heir to the guardian bloodline, created centuries ago through the combined magic of every supernatural species on Earth. His ancestors had been bred, shaped, and guided for one singular purpose: to find and bond with the last Phoenix heir when the time came for the Great Awakening. Every aspect of his life, from his business success to supernatural strength, had been enhanced by ancient magic to ensure he would be worthy of his Phoenix mate when fate finally brought them together. As their physical union reached its crescendo, Kieran saw the terrible truth behind their love story. The chance meeting at the cemetery hadn't been chance at all. It had been orchestrated by mystical forces that had been guiding both their lives since birth. His instant recognition of her as his mate, the way every obstacle had fallen away to allow their bonding, even Marcus's vampire nature that had kept Seraphina's power suppressed until the perfect moment. All of it had been part of an intricate supernatural design spanning centuries. The most horrifying revelation came as their bond solidified completely. In the vision, Kieran saw the prophecy that had shaped his entire bloodline. When the last Phoenix and her guardian alpha mate fully bonded, their combined power would trigger the Great Awakening, a supernatural apocalypse that would cause every hidden creature on Earth to manifest their true nature simultaneously. Werewolves, vampires, witches, fae, and countless other supernatural beings would be unable to maintain their human disguises. The hidden world that had existed in shadow for millennia would be exposed in a single, catastrophic moment. The consequences of such an event played out in the vision with terrifying clarity. Humans, faced with the sudden revelation that monsters from their darkest nightmares were real and had been living among them, would react with predictable terror and violence. Wars would erupt across the globe as supernatural beings were forced to defend themselves against human persecution. Cities would burn, governments would fall, and millions would die in the chaos that followed. The careful balance between the supernatural and human worlds would be destroyed forever, likely leading to the extinction of one or both species. Seraphina felt Kieran's sudden tension even through the haze of their bonding, sensing the horror and despair flooding through their connection. "What's wrong?" she whispered, her hands framing his face as she saw the anguish in his golden eyes. "I can feel your pain through our bond. What did you see?" Her phoenix fire responded to his distress, flames dancing along her skin as her protective instincts awakened. The vision had shattered something fundamental in Kieran's understanding of their love, and she could feel his soul recoiling from some terrible truth. "We've been played," Kieran said, his voice broken with the weight of revelation. "Everything, our meeting, our love, this bond, it's all been orchestrated by forces we never knew existed. We're not choosing our destiny, Seraphina. We're fulfilling a prophecy that was written in blood centuries before we were born." He pulled away from her, his face twisted with self-loathing and despair. "I'm not the man you think I am. I'm just a tool, shaped and guided by ancient magic to serve a purpose that will destroy everything we've ever known." The truth spilled from him in a torrent of anguish as he explained the vision, the guardian bloodline, and the terrible prophecy their bonding had set in motion. Seraphina listened with growing horror as she realized the full scope of their manipulation. Her mother's sacrifice, her years of suffering under Marcus's influence, even her survival until this moment, All of it had been part of a cosmic plan that treated them like chess pieces rather than people with free will. "The Great Awakening has already begun," Kieran said, his voice hollow with despair. "I can feel it in the mate bond, the power building between us. Soon, every supernatural being on Earth will lose the ability to hide among humans." "But maybe that's not a bad thing," Seraphina said, though her voice shook with uncertainty. "Maybe the hidden world was never meant to exist forever. Maybe it's time for truth, even if it's difficult." Her phoenix fire flickered uncertainly as she grappled with the implications of their bonding. The love she felt for Kieran was real, regardless of how it had been orchestrated, but the consequences of that love were staggering to contemplate. "We can't undo what we've done, and I wouldn't want to even if we could. But we can choose how we face what comes next." Before Kieran could respond, the peaceful aftermath of their bonding was shattered by the sound of glass exploding in the living room. The building shook with supernatural force, and both of them could feel the presence of multiple powerful beings converging on the penthouse. Kieran was moving before the echoes faded, his naked form shifting seamlessly into wolf shape as he bounded toward the disturbance. His enhanced senses immediately identified the intruders, not just Marcus and his vampire allies, but representatives from every major supernatural faction. The council had arrived in force, and they were here to prevent the completion of the prophecy by any means necessary. Seraphina followed, wrapping herself in his discarded shirt, and found chaos waiting for them. The penthouse was filled with supernatural beings of every description: werewolves in human form with eyes blazing gold, vampires moving with inhuman grace, witches whose very presence made the air crackle with magical energy, and creatures she couldn't even identify. At their head stood a woman whose authority was unmistakable, tall, ethereally beautiful, with silver hair and eyes that held the weight of centuries. This was the High Counselor, the being who governed all supernatural law. "Kieran Shadow Moon," the High Counselor said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the windows vibrate. "You have committed the gravest crime possible against our kind. The mate bond you have forged with the Phoenix heir has already begun to unravel the veil that protects us all. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Her words were punctuated by a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, and Seraphina realized with growing horror that the building around them was beginning to change, reality itself shifting as the Great Awakening gathered momentum. "I know exactly what I've done," Kieran replied, his wolf form radiating defiant power despite being vastly outnumbered. "I've found my mate and claimed her as is my right. If the prophecy is true, if our bonding triggers the Great Awakening, then maybe it's time for the supernatural world to stop hiding in shadows." His words sparked angry growls and hisses from the assembled council members, but he stood firm in his conviction. "We've lived as prisoners of human ignorance for too long. Perhaps exposure is exactly what we need." The High Counselor's expression darkened with an emotion that might have been pity. "You speak of exposure as if it's liberation, but you have no comprehension of the consequences. When the veil falls, when every supernatural being on Earth is forced to reveal their true nature, the humans will not welcome us with open arms. They will see us as threats to be eliminated, monsters to be destroyed. The wars that follow will make every conflict in human history seem like playground disputes." Her words carried the weight of absolute certainty, backed by centuries of careful observation and planning. "Then we fight," Seraphina said, stepping forward with phoenix fire dancing around her skin like living jewelry. "We've spent our entire lives being told we're worthless, being manipulated by forces we couldn't see. If our love is going to change the world, then at least it will be honest change. No more lies, no more hiding, no more living in fear of what others might think if they knew the truth." Her declaration sent ripples of power through the assembled supernatural beings, and several of them stepped back as they felt the full force of her awakened heritage. The confrontation that followed would determine the fate of two worlds. The council had come prepared for war, but they had underestimated the combined power of a fully bonded phoenix and her guardian alpha. As supernatural forces clashed in the heart of Ravencrest, the Great Awakening continued to build momentum, reality itself beginning to shift as the ancient veil that had hidden the supernatural world for millennia started to crumble. The love story that had begun at a cemetery was about to reshape the entire world, and neither Kieran nor Seraphina would back down from the destiny they had claimed together. The battle erupted with supernatural fury as council forces moved to separate the bonded mates before their connection could complete the prophetic awakening. Kieran's wolf form became a blur of lethal grace, his guardian bloodline enhancements allowing him to match creatures that should have been far beyond his power level. Meanwhile, Seraphina's phoenix fire blazed with increasing intensity, silver flames that could burn through magical shields and supernatural flesh alike. Together, they were exactly what the prophecy had promised, a force capable of changing the fundamental nature of reality itself. As the fight raged around them, both Kieran and Seraphina felt the weight of their impossible choice. Their love was real, their bond was sacred, but the consequences of their union would reshape the world in ways that could lead to unprecedented destruction. Yet looking into each other's eyes across the chaos of battle, they both knew they would make the same choice again. Some truths were worth any price, and some loves were powerful enough to change everything, even if that change came with the risk of losing everything they held dear. The power that erupted from Seraphina was unlike anything in werewolf lore, pure, crackling energy that sent the silver-armed hunters flying across the room like broken dolls. Her eyes blazed not with golden wolf light, but with silver fire that seemed to pierce straight through to the soul. When she raised her hand, lightning crackled between her fingers, and the very air around her began to shimmer with otherworldly power. Marcus scrambled backward in terror, his face pale as he witnessed something that shouldn't exist. "What are you?" he screamed, but Seraphina's attention was focused entirely on Kieran, who was struggling to his feet despite the silver burning in his blood. The wounded alpha watched his mate with awe and growing understanding as pieces of an ancient puzzle fell into place. "Phoenix," he whispered, the word carrying the weight of legend and prophecy. "You're not just human, my love. You're the last of the Phoenix line." Supernatural beings of immense power who were thought extinct centuries ago. As if responding to his recognition, flames began to dance around Seraphina's skin without burning her, and when she touched Kieran's silver wounds, they healed instantly under her supernatural fire. The hunters fled in terror, Marcus among them, but their retreat felt less like victory and more like a temporary reprieve. In the aftermath, as Seraphina's power settled into something she could control, Kieran explained the implications of what she'd become. The Phoenix bloodline had been the natural allies and mates of alpha werewolves, their combined powers creating bonds that could reshape the supernatural world. "This is why you felt so alone," he said, pulling her close as dawn broke over Ravencrest. "You weren't meant for the human world any more than I was. The mate bond didn't just bring us together, it awakened your true nature." Their love had literally transformed her into something more than human, something that could stand as his equal in the supernatural realm. But their happiness was destined to be short-lived. As they stood together watching the sunrise, both still marveling at the magnitude of their connection, Kieran's phone buzzed with a message that made his blood run cold. The text was from an unknown number, but the sender's identity was unmistakable. "The Council has been informed of the Phoenix Awakening. She is too dangerous to exist. You have 72 hours to eliminate the threat, or we will send forces that even an alpha cannot defeat. Choose wisely, Kieran Shadowmoon, your pack or your mate." The message was signed with the seal of the High Council, the governing body that ruled all supernatural beings with an iron fist. Kieran's arms tightened around Seraphina as he realized their trials were far from over. The mate bond had saved them both, awakened powers beyond imagination, and given them love worth dying for, but it had also painted a target on both their backs. As he looked into her silver fire eyes, now blazing with determination rather than fear, he knew they would face whatever came together. "Let them come," Seraphina said, her voice carrying new harmonics of power that made the windows sing. "I've spent my whole life being called worthless, being told I don't belong. Now I know what I am and I know who I'm fighting for." For the first time, Seraphina felt safe in Kieran's arms, but in the shadows of the city, Ancient enemies had already begun to gather, and the blood moon rising in 3 days would bring trials that would test not just their love, but their very survival.